In a sealed file in the German Federal Military Archives in Freiburg, there is a report that stayed classified for half a century. It was written by a German engineer in the spring of 1943 after he spent 6 weeks inside a captured American tank. The men in Berlin who needed to read that report never did. If they had, the war in Europe might have ended a year sooner, and tens of thousands of American boys might have come home alive who did not. This is the story of what that engineer found inside the Sherman, and what it cost Germany not to listen. The morning was cold for April. A wind off the Brandenburg Plain pushed across the concrete apron at Kummersdorf, 20 miles south of Berlin, and Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp stood with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at something that should not have been there. It was an American tank, an M4A1 Sherman, olive drab paint still showing the red dust of North Africa in its seams. White star on the hull, partly scratched away by sand and by the German hands that had bolted on the new license plate. 47 years old, the chief engineer of Waffenprüfamt 6, the man who had helped shape every panzer in the German order of battle, walked slowly around the machine. He stopped at the front glacis. He touched it. The metal was cold under his palm. He had read the report from Tunisia. He had seen the photographs. He had not expected to feel anything when he saw the tank in person. He was a man of measurements, not impressions. And yet, as he stood there on that April morning in 1943, something in him had already begun to shift. He did not know it yet. He would soon. To understand what that tank was doing on a German proving ground, you have to go back 2 months and 3,000 kilometers to a desert valley in central Tunisia where the United States Army learned in a single afternoon that everything it believed about modern war was wrong. The date was the 14th of February 1943, Valentine's Day. Before dawn, sandstorms rolled across the plain west of the Fayed Pass. Behind the wind came the 10th Panzer Division, and behind them the 21st, two of the most experienced armoured formations in the Wehrmacht, sliding through the dust like a knife through cloth, aimed at a thin line of American infantry and tanks holding the village of Sidi Bouzid. The Americans had been in North Africa for 3 months. Most of them had never heard a tank gun fired at them. They had trained in the California desert, marked enemy positions with wooden stakes, and shipped out believing they understood war. They did not understand it. Not yet. By midday on the 15th, the order came down. Counterattack. Lieutenant Colonel Louis V. Hightower was 35 years old, a West Point graduate, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Armoured Regiment, 1st Armoured Division. He led 51 M4 Sherman tanks east across open ground in broad daylight toward German positions he could not see. There was no air cover, there was no reconnaissance. There was only the order, and a young officer who knew in some quiet part of himself that an order is not the same thing as a plan. The 10th Panzer Division was waiting. Tigers of Schwere Panzerabteilung 501 dug in along the ridgeline, 88mm guns hidden in palm groves, Stukas circling at altitude, waiting for the call. The Americans rolled into the kill sack at full speed. The first ranging shots came at 1,200 meters. The first Shermans began to burn at 1,000. What happened over the next 4 hours was not a battle, it was an execution. Hightower's own tank, named Texas, fought until it had fired its last round. He had personally engaged 4 German tanks before the 88 finally found him. When the turret took the killing hit, the gunner was dead and the tank was burning. Only then did the colonel order the crew out. He climbed down into the sand, looked back at the wreckage of his battalion, and began to walk. He walked west, toward Speitler, past the wreckage of his own command. The smoke was so thick the sun looked like a coin. By nightfall, 44 of his 51 Shermans were gone. Some were burning, some were simply stopped, engines still ticking, crews scattered into the brush. Some had taken light hits, a track thrown, a sponson holed, damage that an experienced crew might have stayed with, might have fought through. But these were not experienced crews. These were boys from Pennsylvania and Texas and Iowa who had bailed out at the first hot crack of an 88, who had run because running was the only thing their bodies knew how to do. Over the next 3 days, the disaster grew. The Americans lost nearly 1,600 men, 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, 29 artillery pieces. The name attached to the whole catastrophe would not be Sidi Bouzid, it would be the pass to the north where the route finally stopped, Kasserine. And in the wreckage, in the cold desert dawn of the 16th and 17th of February, the Germans began to walk among the abandoned tanks. This is where the story turns. Because what happened next was not what should have happened. A reconnaissance party from Schwerer Panzerabteilung 501, the Tiger Battalion, found an M4A1 sitting alone in a wadi north of Sidi Bou Zid. The hatches were open, the crew was gone, the engine, by the warmth of the manifold, had been shut down only hours earlier, the radio was still on its frequency. There was a half-eaten ration tin on the gunner's seat. A cigarette had burned itself out on the turret floor. The tank was undamaged. Now, what the Germans usually did with a captured enemy vehicle was simple. They stripped it, they pulled out anything useful, anything they could send back to Berlin for evaluation, and they left the carcass to rust. They had done it with hundreds of Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. They had done it with French Char Bs and British Matildas in 1940. They were experts at the dismantling of enemies. But this time, someone, a German officer whose name has not survived, gave a different order. He took a paint can and a brush. He walked to the side of the Sherman. And on the hull, in heavy black German letters that anyone in the battalion would understand, he wrote "Nicht zerlegen, reserviert für OKH, do not dismantle, reserved for high command." Think about what that sentence means. It means that within hours of looking at the tank, this German officer, a man whose entire war up to that point had been spent destroying American equipment, had decided that this particular machine was worth more than its parts. It was worth more than the propaganda photographs, it was worth more than the scrap value of its armor, it was worth keeping alive, and he was not the only one who noticed. A crew was assigned, 4 men, Panzer veterans, who climbed inside the Sherman with no manual, no instruction, no familiarity with the controls. They started the engine. The Continental R975 radial caught on the second turn of the starter. They put the tank in gear, the transmission engaged. They drove it out of the wadi and turned northeast toward the coast. The destination was Sfax, a port on the Mediterranean from which captured equipment could be loaded onto transport ships and sent to Italy, then by rail to Germany. The distance was 350 kilometers across unpaved Tunisian roads, through rain, through cold desert nights and hot afternoons, through territory that had been a battlefield only days before, where the tracks of the route were scarred with shell craters and the bodies of camels and men. The journey took 4.5 days, and here is the detail you must hold in your mind. Hold it carefully, because it will return again and again in this story, like a refrain in a song. Nothing broke, not the engine, not the transmission, not the final drives, not the tracks, not the suspension, not a single bolt, not a single bearing, not a single fitting. The German crew that drove it noticed. They did not yet know what they were noticing. They were soldiers, not engineers. But somewhere in the 4.5 days of vibration and dust and engine noise, a quiet knowledge had begun to settle into the backs of their minds. They had spent the war driving Panzer IIs and Panzer IVs that needed daily attention. They had heard the stories from the Eastern Front, the new Tigers throwing their final drives after only a few hundred kilometers, needing factory-level repair, sitting motionless while the war moved past them. 500 kilometers. That was the figure whispered in the Tiger battalions. A TAI in field conditions could not be trusted past 500 kilometers without major overhaul. The Sherman had done 350, and it could have done more. At Sfax, the tank was loaded onto a transport ship. The ship crossed the Mediterranean. The tank was unloaded in Italy, placed on a flat car, and shipped by rail across the Alps, through Munich, through Leipzig, into the cold spring air of Brandenburg. And on the 14th of April, 1943, it rolled off the railhead at Kummersdorf, where Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp was waiting. Kniepkamp was not a sentimental man. He had built his career on the precision of German engineering. He had been part of the team that had designed the Panther. He had signed off on the suspension systems of the Tiger. He believed, with the kind of belief that does not need to be stated, that German tanks were the finest in the world. He had no reason, in April of 1943, to think otherwise. He climbed up onto the Sherman's hull. He lowered himself through the commander's hatch. His feet found the turret basket floor. The fighting compartment smelled of cordite and rubber and the faint, sweet odor of American gun oil that was not quite the same as the gun oil he knew. He stood there for a moment in the silence of the steel, and he began, very methodically, to look. His first impression, the one he would write down in his report a few weeks later, was not admiration. It was something closer to disdain. He saw rough castings. He saw welds that a German foreman would have rejected. He saw fittings that did not gleam, surfaces that were merely smooth instead of polished, tolerances that he would later describe with a phrase that became famous in German engineering circles: loose Toleranzen. Loose tolerances. He meant it as a criticism. He meant that the Americans, in their hurry, in their inexperience, had built a tank that was not finished, not refined, not quite up to the standard a serious nation would demand of itself. He would spend the next 6 weeks at Kummersdorf testing this tank. He would measure every armor plate. He would fire German anti-tank rounds into duplicate steel and record the penetration. He would run the engine on a dynamometer. He would weigh the components. He would sketch the gear teeth in his notebooks. He would do everything a German engineer in 1943 knew how to do, and by the end of those 6 weeks, the phrase loose tolerances would mean something to him that it had not meant before. It would mean the future. It would mean the war was already lost. But on that cold April morning, standing in the turret of a tank built by railroad workers in Ohio, Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp did not yet know what he was looking at. He only knew that something was wrong, and he was going to find out what it was. The Sherman sat under the floodlights of Kummersdorf for 6 weeks. Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp and a team of engineers moved around it like surgeons around a patient on the table, opening it up piece by piece, weighing what they pulled out, sketching it, measuring it, comparing it to the German equivalent. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Kniepkamp asked for something specific. He wanted a second Sherman, a second M for A1, also captured in Tunisia, also driven to the coast and shipped across the Mediterranean, had arrived at Kummersdorf the week before. This tank was different. It had been built by Pressed Steel Car Company in Hegewisch, Pennsylvania. The first tank, the one Kniepkamp had been working on for weeks, had been built by Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. 2 factories, 600 kilometers apart. Neither one had ever manufactured a tank before 1942. Kniepkamp ordered his men to remove a road wheel assembly from the pressed steel car tank. They walked it across the workshop floor to the Lima tank. They lifted it into position. It fit. No filing, no shims, no tapping the bolt holes into alignment. The wheel slid onto the suspension arm of a tank built 600 kilometers away by different men, in a different factory, in a different month, and it fit as though it had been made that morning for that exact vehicle. Kniepkamp said nothing. He walked to the workbench. He picked up a turret fitting from the second tank. It fit the first. He tried a transmission housing bolt pattern. It matched. He tried the gun mantlet bracket, the track tensioner, the hatch hinges, the radio rack, the driver's instrument panel. Every component from every position on the tank, taken from a machine built in Pennsylvania, slid into place on a machine built in Ohio, without resistance, without adjustment, without a single tool beyond what a field mechanic would carry in his back pocket. You have to understand what the men in that room were seeing. In Germany in 1943, a Panther tank built by Mann in Nuremberg was, in a real and physical sense, not the same machine as a Panther built by Daimler-Benz in Berlin. They looked alike, they mounted the same gun, but the parts inside them were not interchangeable. A final drive made for the Nuremberg production line could not be bolted into a Berlin Panther without hours of filing and fitting by a master machinist. If you needed a transmission for a Tiger that had thrown its gears in Russia, you did not order a transmission. You ordered a transmission specifically machined for that specific Tiger, from that specific batch, made by hand by men who had trained for years. It was a beautiful system. It was the system of a nation that built things to last, and it was about to lose a war, because the Americans had built something else. The Americans had built a tank where the parts did not have to be perfect, they only had to be close enough. And to be close enough, a small-town mechanic with a wrench could keep them running. Kniepkamp wrote it down in his notebook. He underlined the conclusion. What he had called sloppiness was not sloppiness at all. It was strategy. He kept opening panels. Behind the driver's seat, mounted low against the hull, he found something he had never seen in any tank: German, Soviet, French, or British. A small gasoline engine the size of a bread box, a single cylinder, air-cooled, connected to a generator. The Americans had welded it into the corner of the fighting compartment as if it were nothing remarkable. As if every tank should have one. A home-light auxiliary power unit, it ran the tank's electrical system independently of the main engine, the radio, the turret traverse motor, the interior lighting, the gun controls, all of it operational without burning a drop of the precious aviation gasoline that fed the big Continental radial up front, without announcing the tank's position to every Soviet listening post with the rumble of a 500 horsepower engine idling in the dark. And there was something else. The exhaust from the little home light was ducted into the crew compartment in cold weather. Heating, not much, but some. Kniepkamp thought of the German tankers he knew. The boys from Hamburg and Munich and Cologne, who would, before the year was out, be sitting in steel boxes in the winter forests of the Ardennes and the frozen plains of Belarus at whatever temperature the air decided to give them. He thought of the Tiger crew who had to choose, on a freezing night, between turning on the main engine to warm the compartment and burning fuel they could not replace, or shutting it down and watching their breath freeze on the gun breech. He wrote down the auxiliary generator. He did not editorialize. He kept moving. In the turret, bolted to a bracket on the right side of the gun, he found two more things. A compact hydraulic pump driven by an electric motor. The oil gear traverse system. He activated it. The turret rotated 360 degrees in 15 seconds. His Panthers, the ones he had helped design, the ones rolling off the line at Nuremberg that very month, took 60 seconds for the same rotation when the main engine was idling. If the engine was off, as it would be in any ambush position to conserve fuel, the gunner had a hand crank, no power at all, the later Panzer IV, the Ausf. J, which would begin production a year from this morning, would have the powered traverse deleted entirely. The crew would crank the turret by hand, like it was 1932. And next to the oil gear pump, Kniepkamp found something stranger, a small gyroscope housing, hydraulic actuators, wiring that ran down into the gun cradle, a Westinghouse gyrostabilizer. He did not understand it at first. He pulled the cover. He sketched the mechanism: a spinning wheel, a pendulum, a pair of pistons that pushed against the gun trunnions. He activated the system with the tank stationary, and he watched the gun barrel hold itself level when he applied force. It was a stabilizer for firing on the move. The Americans, on top of everything else, had built a tank where the gunner could keep his sight on the target while the vehicle bounced across broken ground. When the tank halted, the gun was already close to aim. The gunner needed only a small correction. He could fire a round within seconds of stopping. A Panther coming to a halt needed the gunner to wrestle the long, heavy 75mm barrel back onto target, fighting the momentum of the stop, compensating for the bounce. Waiting for the dust to clear. 6 seconds, 8 seconds, sometimes more. In a tank engagement, 6 seconds was the distance between living and dying. Kniepkamp wrote it all down. He had been a believer. He still wanted to be. He told himself that the German tanks had thicker armor, longer guns, better optics. He told himself that the Panther, when it reached the front, would change the war. And then in early June of 1943, he was summoned to a demonstration. The location was Hillersleben, an artillery proving ground on the Kolbitz-Letzlinger Heath, northwest of Magdeburg. The date was the 6th of June, 1 year to the day before another 6th of June that would change everything. The night before the demonstration, on the 5th of June, Reichsminister Albert Speer stood in front of 10,000 armaments workers at the Berliner Sportpalast and delivered a speech about the miracle of German production. Speer was 38 years old, tall, quiet, an architect by training, Adolf Hitler's favorite among his ministers. He had been running the Reich's war production for a little over a year, and he was very good at his job, in the way that a man can be very good at a job that is fundamentally impossible. He read out the numbers. Munitions output, he said, was up 600% since 1941. Artillery production, fourfold. Tank deliveries had reached 1,250% of baseline. The crowd interrupted him with applause. The numbers were staggering. They were also a lie, not a fabrication. The percentages were real, but Speer had chosen his baseline year very carefully. He had picked the moment in 1941 when German production had been at its lowest, a period when factories had been idle, when retooling had slowed everything down, when the army had been resting between campaigns. He was comparing a recovering patient to a man in a coma and calling it a resurrection, because the absolute numbers, the ones he did not say out loud, the ones that did not fit into a speech, told a different story. In 1943, the United States would produce more than 29,000 tanks, the Soviet Union more than 24,000. Germany would produce just over 12,000 armored vehicles of all types, including assault guns, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery. Of those, only about 6,000 were actual tanks. The Americans by themselves were outproducing Germany by a factor of nearly 5. Speer did not say that. He did not need to. The men in the audience had no way to check. After the speech, Speer and the senior factory directors boarded a fleet of buses powered by wood gas generators because gasoline was too precious to waste on civilian transport, and they drove through the night to Hillersleben. The next morning, on the firing range, the captured Shermans sat on the packed earth between German vehicles, rockets, heavy guns. A Panzerwerfer half-track, a propaganda film crew was setting up cameras. And beside the Sherman, for the first time in public, sat a vehicle that most of the men present had never seen. A Panther, Ausführung D, the very first production model. Built by Mann in Nuremberg, probably in April, it weighed 43 metric tons. It mounted the long-barreled 75mm K-42, one of the finest tank guns of the war. Its frontal armor was 80mm, sloped at 55 degrees. On paper, it was everything Germany needed to overmatch the T-34 in the East, and anything the Western Allies could field. The demonstration was simple. Both tanks would attempt to climb a steep, muddy slope. The Sherman went first. It churned uphill, tracks clawing at the soft loam, the Continental radial engine straining at full throttle, and it slid back. It could not make the grade. The camera filmed every second. The film would be edited for newsreels across the Reich. Then the Panther went, 700 horsepower from the Maybach HL 230 engine. Wider tracks, better weight distribution. It climbed, it crested. The spectators, Reichsminister Speer, the factory directors, the senior Wehrmacht officers, watched the Panther conquer the slope that the American tank could not. Whether the Sherman might have made that slope under a different driver, on different ground with different conditions, would never be tested. The propaganda needed only one take. The cameras stopped rolling. The story was written before the engines had cooled. A week later, the magazine Signal ran the photographs across 2 pages. General Sherman fell back, one caption read. His German contender, a new heavy tank, conquered the same obstacle. That was the story Germany told itself in June of 1943. Here is the story Germany did not tell. 5 weeks later, on the 5th of July, the Panther went to war. 200 Panthers of the 51st and 52nd Panzer battalions rolled forward at Kursk in the largest tank battle in history. Operation Citadel, the last great offensive Hitler would ever launch in the East. 2,700 German armored vehicles against a Soviet force more than twice that size, dug into defensive belts 40 kilometers deep. The Panther was the secret weapon. It was the answer to the T-34. It was the machine that would punch a hole through Soviet lines and let the panzer divisions race for Moscow. Within 24 hours, more than half of the Panthers were out of action, not from Soviet guns, from mechanical failure. The fuel pumps leaked. The pumps had been designed in a hurry, mass-produced in a hurry, and they failed under sustained operation. Some leaked into the engine compartment and caught fire. Panthers burned in fields where no Soviet shell had touched them. The transmissions seized. The Maybach engine made too much torque for the gearbox man had built around it. Drivers ground their gears under stress and broke teeth off the cogs. But the worst of it, the catastrophe that would haunt the Panther for the rest of its existence, was the final drives. The final drive is the last gear set in the powertrain. It takes the rotation from the transmission and translates it through a 90-degree turn to the drive sprocket that pulls the track. It is the component that bears the entire weight of the tank every time the vehicle accelerates, every time it climbs, every time it turns. The Panther's final drive had been designed in a rush. The engineers had built it small to fit the chassis. They had built it with fewer teeth on each gear to save on machining time. They had built it from chrome molybdenum steel when they could get molybdenum, which by mid-1943 they often could not. The math was brutal. A Sherman's final drive had so many teeth that each individual tooth carried a small share of the load. The gears spread the stress across the metal. They could absorb impact, vibration, the shock of a track running over a tank trap. They were forgiving. A Panther's final drive had a quarter of the teeth. Each one carried 4 times the stress. Under combat conditions, they sheared. By the end of the first week at Kursk, operational readiness in the Panther battalions had dropped to 16%. Out of every 6 Panthers that had rolled toward the front, 5 were sitting motionless somewhere behind the lines, waiting for parts that would not come, waiting for mechanics who were not trained, waiting for tools that did not exist in the field. The crews were watching their tanks die under them, not from enemy fire, but from the choices made by engineers in factories 2,000 kilometers away. Somewhere in Germany, the captured Sherman sat in a shed at Kummersdorf. Its engines still started, its transmissions still shifted, every part still fit, and nobody in Berlin was talking about the hill anymore. Kniepkamp finished his report. He did not publish his conclusions. He could not. The conclusions were dangerous. To say what he had found was to suggest that the Reich was losing a war it had not yet visibly lost. So he wrote his report in the careful, technical language of a German engineer, and he buried the truth in the margins, in the footnotes, in the choice of which numbers to compare. The Warproof 6 file on the M4A1 Sherman was classified. It went into the archive. The men who needed to read it never did. A year passed. The Panther was modified. The final drives were redesigned, slightly, but the fundamental flaw remained. The Reich poured steel and labor and brilliant engineering into a tank that by its very design could not be sustained. And on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, 1 year to the day after the demonstration at Hillersleben, ships began to disgorge their cargoes onto 5 beaches in Normandy. But the cargo that landed in those first days was not what most people remember. It was not just the tanks, it was not just the men, it was 50,000 individual Sherman components. Road wheels, track links, transmission assemblies, engine blocks, turret rings, periscope heads, hydraulic lines for the oil gear traverse, gyroscope units for the Westinghouse stabilizer. Every part stamped with a federal stock number that matched every other part with the same number, regardless of which factory had made it. Behind the transport ships came something stranger. Floating repair depots, welding equipment, machine lathes, engine hoists, all of it mounted on vessels that would anchor off the Normandy shore and begin processing damaged tanks within hours of the first wave hitting the sand. The United States Army had designed a 5-tier repair system. They called them echelons. First echelon was the crew themselves, fixing what they could with tools stowed in the tank. Second echelon was the company maintenance section. Third was battalion and regimental shops capable of swapping major assemblies. Fourth was division-level depots with overhead cranes and machine tools. Fifth was rear area rebuild facilities that could take a hull, scorched black by fire, and return it to service. A Sherman knocked out on Tuesday could be a repaired Sherman on Friday. A Panther knocked out on Tuesday was scrap metal. By August of 1944, 2 months after the invasion, American armored units in France were operating at 85% readiness. German panzer divisions had dropped to 50 and falling. The arithmetic was no longer a question of who built the better tank. It was a question of who built the better system. And somewhere in a maintenance tent in Normandy, 20-year-old corporal from a town in Indiana who had been fixing Chevrolets 18 months earlier was bolting a transmission from a wrecked Sherman into another Sherman whose own transmission lay smoking in a hedge. He did not need a master machinist, he did not need a factory, he had a wrench, a manual, and a part that fit. He did not know it, but he was winning the war. And across the line, in the Bocage country south of Caen, a young German tanker named Erwin Bachmann was beginning to understand what he was up against. He had been fighting since Poland. He had 4 operational Panthers left. He was 23 years old. The winter of 1944 into 1945 was the coldest in Europe in a generation. In the hills above the Rhine, frost lay on the trees like white wool, and the rivers ran with ice that scraped against the stone bridges. The German army that had marched into France 4.5 years earlier as the strongest land force on the continent was now a shape that men recognized only from the helmets they still wore. The regiments had names. The names had little behind them. Obersturmführer Erwin Bachmann was 23 years old. He had been fighting for 6 years. Poland, France, Yugoslavia, the Eastern Front. He had been in uniform since the war began, and now he sat in the sidecar of a motorcycle on a frozen road in Alsace, looking at the village of Hellesheim through field glasses, counting tanks he could not afford to fight. He was the adjutant of the 1st Battalion, 10th SS Panzer Regiment of the Frundsberg Division. His battalion was supposed to have 100 armoured vehicles. He had 4 Panthers. 4. Operation Nordwind was the name they had given to the offensive. It had begun on New Year's Eve, while the Ardennes attack to the north was already bleeding to death in the snow. The plan had been to break through American lines in Alsace and recover lost ground. The plan had not survived its first week. By the middle of January, the offensive had become a series of village fights. Each one fought for its own sake, because there was nothing else left to fight for. A patrol came back from Hellesheim and reported American armor in the streets. How many, the patrol could not say. On the night of the 16th into the 17th of January, elements of the 1st Battalion moved into Hellesheim. Bachmann, as adjutant, was part of the operation. 2 Panthers were positioned at a crossroads. Panzerfaust teams took the doorways and the upstairs windows. The men waited in the cold, in the dark, with their hands tucked under their arms and their breath crystallizing on their collars. The first Sherman came around a corner at 20 meters. The Panthers fired. The lead tank burst into flame. The second tank behind it tried to back up, hit the third tank stalled. The third tank tried to traverse and could not in the narrow space. The American column, men of the 43rd Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division, found themselves trapped between buildings they could not push through and a German ambush they could not outflank. Many of them were replacements who had been in France less than a month. The fight lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, 4 Shermans were burning. The rest had stopped. The crews had climbed out with their hands up. 60 American soldiers surrendered. 20 German prisoners held in the village schoolhouse were freed and rearmed. And in the grey dawn that followed, Bachmann walked down the street between the abandoned tanks. 12 M4A3 Shermans, engines still warm, hatches open, coffee still steaming in tin cups on the gunners' seats. The Americans had bailed out so fast they had left their personal letters in the radio bins. 12 tanks, fully fueled, fully armed. And not a man in his battalion who knew how to drive one. There was no time. American artillery was already finding the range. The shells were walking in from the south, methodical, professional, the kind of fire that meant a counterattack was on the way. Bachmann gave the order anyway. 12 of his men climbed into the captured Shermans. They were Panther crews. They had spent years inside German steel. They sat down in the driver's seats of American tanks for the first time in their lives. They put their hands on the controls. And what they discovered in those first minutes in the cold cab of an M4A3 was what Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp had written in his classified report nearly 2 years earlier at Kummersdorf. The transmission had synchromesh on 4 of the 5 gears. A Panther crew driver double-clutched every shift. He had to. The Panther's gearbox demanded technique. Miss a shift under stress, and you stripped a tooth, and you stopped, and you died in a field somewhere. The Sherman's gearbox forgave. The stick slid from slot to slot like an automobile. A young man who had driven a delivery truck for a butcher in Munich before the war could drive this tank in 10 minutes. They reached for the turret traverse. The turret swung, fast, smooth, electric and hydraulic, the whole mass of gun and mantlet and armor spinning on the ring like it weighed nothing. The oil gear pump that Kniepkamp had sketched in his notebooks at Kummersdorf was now turning a turret in a German hand on a French street. The seats were padded. The instruments were labeled in English, but the labels were so clear that a man who did not read English could still read them: speedometer, temperature, fuel, oil pressure. The needles pointed where they needed to point, and the engines started. These were M4A3 Shermans, a later variant than the one Kniepkamp had tested at Kummersdorf 2 years earlier. The Continental radial up front had been replaced by something built in Dearborn, Michigan by Ford. 12 Ford GAA V8s, 500 horsepower each, dual overhead cams, no belts, no chains. Everything gear-driven, every moving part inside the engine designed to keep moving in cold weather, in dust, in the kind of conditions that would seize a Maybach. They started, the first time. In January cold, on a frozen Alsatian street, Bachmann radioed ahead to make sure his own forces would not fire on him. American silhouettes, German hands. He led the 12 tanks back to Offendorf in the grey light of morning. Every one of them arrived under its own power, not a single mechanical failure. The tanks were repainted with German crosses over the white American stars. They were formed into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment. And here is the detail that tells the whole story. The detail that, more than any other in this war, captures what had been done to Germany by the country it had once mocked as a land of factory workers and Hollywood movies. The Germans did not modify the captured Shermans. When the Wehrmacht captured Soviet T-34s in the early years of the war, they modified them. They added German cupolas. They changed the radios. They adapted the optics. They tried to make the Soviet tanks fit into a German way of fighting. With the Shermans, they changed nothing. They did not add armor. They did not change the turret, they did not replace the gun, they did not adapt the radio, they did not adjust the optics, they climbed in, they drove, they fought. Because there was nothing to fix. 6 days later, on the 23rd of January, in a conference room somewhere in the German military bureaucracy, the men who ran every armoured production program in the Reich gathered for a meeting. It was called the Panzer Commission. The chairman that morning was General Wolfgang Tamale, 54 years old, Chief of Staff to Heinz Guderian, who was now the Inspector General of Armoured Troops. Tamale was a soldier of the old school, Prussian, methodical, loyal. He had spent his career on the eastern frontier and on the staff. He believed in the German army the way a man believes in a church he was born into. He opened the meeting with a report from the front. He did not soften it. The numbers, he said, were these: 500 defective final drives on the Panzer IV, 370 on the Panther, roughly 100 more on the Tiger, almost 1,000 tanks. Not destroyed by the enemy, destroyed by themselves. The same gear failures that had crippled the Panthers at Kursk 20 months earlier had never been solved. The Reich had simply learned to live with them, until now, when there was nothing left to live with. Tamale said something that morning that no senior German officer had ever said this plainly in an official meeting. In such circumstances, he said, an orderly utilization of tanks is simply impossible. And then he said the sentence that the engineers at Kummersdorf could have written 2 years earlier if anyone had been willing to listen. The troops lose their confidence, he said, and in some situations they abandon the whole vehicle just because of this problem. Abandon, not because of enemy fire, because of the machine itself. Picture a German tanker, 20 years old, somewhere east of Berlin in the 3rd week of January. He has been inside the same Panther for 9 months. He has slept in it. He has bled in it. He has watched his commander die in it. He presses the ignition. The Maybach turns over. He puts the tank in gear, releases the clutch, applies the throttle. And somewhere inside the final drive housing, a sound like a sack of hammers thrown into a cement mixer. The tank stops. He has 2 choices: stay and die, or climb out and run. Across a frozen field in a different country, the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment was fighting its way north in 12 captured Shermans. Every morning the tanks started. Every evening they came home. The same quiet miracle the Tunisian crew had ridden 350 kilometers across the desert was now carrying SS troopers across the Vosges in winter, and the tanks did not care which uniform was inside them. In April of 1945, the Red Army crossed the Oder and pushed west toward Berlin. Kummersdorf was in the path. The proving ground where Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp had measured an American tank 2 years earlier was now a few kilometers behind the front. The engineers were burning their files. The records of the tests, the photographs, the measurements, the long classified reports on what they had found inside the Sherman were going into stoves and oil drums in the spring rain. And on the firing ranges the Germans gathered what was left. They called it Panzerkompanie Kummersdorf, a unit of last resort, the vehicles they could still move under their own power. One Tiger II, one Jack Tiger, several Borgward demolition carriers fitted with machine guns, a captured Italian heavy tank that had been at Kummersdorf for evaluation and had no business being on a German battlefield, and at least one American Sherman, possibly two, recovered from the testing ground inventory. The same machines that had arrived at Kummersdorf in 1943 as curiosities, as objects to be measured, to be sketched, to be dismissed in the language of disdain for their loose tolerances, were now the last line of defense. German crews climbed into American tanks to fight Soviet tanks on German soil. The war had begun with panzers rolling through Polish villages in disciplined columns. It ended with locomotive factory tanks from Lima, Ohio, defending a proving ground south of Berlin. Erwin Bachmann's survived. He fought through the retreat across the Rhine. The 13th Company kept its captured Shermans running for several weeks, scavenging American ammunition where they found it. By the final weeks of the war, most of the tanks had been abandoned or destroyed, but a handful kept moving until the end. In May of 1945, near Göttingen, Bachmann drove west and surrendered to the British. He went home, he lived quietly, he never gave a major interview, he did not write a memoir. He went to work, and he married, and he raised a family in a Germany that was learning, slowly, how to live without the war. He died in his late 80s, decades after the war that had shaped his youth and which he had spent the rest of his life trying not to talk about. The classified report that Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp had written at Kummersdorf in the spring of 1943 was found after the war in fragments by Allied investigators sorting through the wreckage of the War-Proof 6 archives. The conclusion, buried in technical language and careful phrasing, was the sentence that the Panzer Commission would arrive at 21 months later. The Americans had not built a better tank. They had built something Germany could not match, a system, a way of making 50,000 of something and making every single one of them right. The men inside the captured Shermans in the winter of 1945 were the first to understand what that meant, not as a statistic in a report, not as a percentage on a chart, as the feel of a synchromesh transmission catching on a Sunday morning shift, as the smooth swing of a turret turning under the hand of a tired man in the cold, as the quiet every morning miracle of an engine that started. The Americans did not win the war because they were braver. The German soldiers were as brave as any men who have ever lived. The Americans won because they had figured out how to build a tank that worked, and then to build 50,000 of them, and to ship the parts across an ocean, and to teach a corporal from Indiana how to fix one with a wrench. Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp lived through the war. He worked after 1945 on civilian projects in West Germany. He never spoke publicly about the Sherman. He did not have to. The verdict was inside him, where he had carried it since April of 1943, on a cold concrete apron south of Berlin, when he climbed up onto the hull of an American tank and lowered himself into the silencer fire turret and stood there, alone, in the place where a war is decided. Not in the field. In the moment a man understands what the other side has built.